Hey, welcome everyone. Good morning. We'll just give a few seconds for everyone to keep logging in, get that number nice and high before we kick off, but we'll get started pretty soon. We've got lots to talk about today once again. Great. Lots coming in quickly. We love a punctual crowd. Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Okay, I'm just going to give it a few more seconds and then we'll kick off. All right, we've got quite a few in already, so we might get started and let everyone just continue to join us as we go. So before we start our event today, I of course want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. So as we gather for this event, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, we take this moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so recognise the various traditional lands on which we come together today. I acknowledge that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Luchi Luchi and Bakinji people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. So thank you everyone for joining us today for this event. I'm Dr. Casey Simons and I'll be co-hosting this event today with my colleague, Associate Professor Adam Karg. This is our final event for our Sport Fan Series that the Sport Innovation Research Group have hosted over the last 6 weeks. And I can't believe that we're at the third and final session already. They've really flown by and we have very much enjoyed delivering diverse discussions on the different touch points of the modern sport fan experience, focusing on fan connections, narratives and consumption. The Sport Innovation Research Group would also like to acknowledge that this series of events has been supported and facilitated by the Social Innovation Research Institute, and we thank Paul Levy especially for his continued assistance in helping us to deliver these events. We've loved working with you, Paul, and we would also like to thank Melanie Nam, our Research Support Officer, who has helped bring these events to life as well. Our last two events brought about a lot of discussion, ideas and questions to how we might continue to work on different aspects in the fan engagement, content delivery and social connection to sports space. And we're thrilled to, again, have one more hour with you all to continue that discussion with some more amazing guests lined up today that we'll introduce shortly. Thank you to everyone who has already joined us for our previous events. So our first event, Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, with Jessica Luther, Kavitha Davidson, Rana Hussain and Ryan Storr. It was a great start to our series and such a wonderful discussion, which was followed up with our next session, How Narrative Sports Fan Content Builds Fan Connection, with Joanna Lester, Shannon Gill and Noah Cohen. If you missed these panels were all recorded, so you can watch them back on our website, and we'll also circulate the links again to all of our panels after today's session. And I just want to give a quick special shout out to someone who's attending us today on their birthday. So I just wanted to wish a very happy birthday to Kat. Kat has attended all of our Sport Fan Series sessions and we're honoured that you're spending your birthday morning with us, Kat, and we hope we give you a great start to your day. Before we begin, we've just got a little bit of housekeeping. So we will have a Q&A at the end of our session today, like we always do. And again, once again, because we have such a strong attendance, which is fantastic, we've got a lot of people here that I'm sure you've got lots of questions. So to make that a bit easier, we'll just use the chat function to facilitate this. So if you have any questions that come to mind throughout the session, just pop them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible at the end. As I mentioned, today's session will also be recorded. So if you're frantically writing down notes, never fear, we've got a recording for you so you can reflect back on all of the discussion today, so you can sit back and relax. So now, without further ado, let's get to today's topic, trends and innovation in sport fan consumption. There is a lot to unpack today as we address this topic. So for this session, we've broken it down into 5 key themes that we'll ask our panel to address. So we've got observation, looking at the trends in sport consumption pre-COVID, changes during COVID-19, changing nature of fandom, sport as social tool and fan connection, and some future thinking. So looking at innovations with a research focus. And we've got a sensational expert panel to help us address these areas. We also have some vision that's been provided from the Richmond Football Club, partners of Swinburne University, and we've asked players David Asprey and Kane Lambert for some reflections on the current sport landscape to get some athlete insights, and we're really grateful for the Football Club to give us their time and effort to creating that content for us. I'm so looking forward to getting stuck into this discussion and thrilled that I can do it all again with my colleague from the Sport Innovation Research Group, Associate Professor Adam Karg, who I'll introduce to everyone now. So good morning, Adam. I'm going to ask you to introduce our expert panel today, but first, what are you most looking forward to discussing today with our experts?
Look, I think it's really bringing everything together. I think the last couple of sessions have been fantastic to talk about some of the different types of content and narratives, and really excited to hear from three people today who very much will bring a different perspective to some of the new things that are happening in sport consumption. Not talking only about the last 6 months, but also about the trends up until then and what some of those implications are. So I might jump in if I can, Casey, and introduce our panel. We'll start with Dan Migala, who joins us. Dan is the co-founder of Forefront. Dan, welcome along.
Great to be here, all the way from North America.
Fantastic, and thanks for joining us on what is your Thursday night. Paul Yeomans joins us as well from PMY Consulting. Paul, thanks for joining us. Good to have you.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me, guys.
Fantastic. And also Paul Fuller, who joins us as a Director of Client Services from Nielsen. Lots of background in sport consumer research. Paul, thanks for joining us and looking forward to your insights.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, pleasure to be here. I'm also based in Melbourne, so I've been at home for quite a while the past few months, but always nice to connect with all of you.
Fantastic. I'll turn it back to Casey to get us started.
Thanks, Adam. As I mentioned, we've got these 5 key areas to discuss today, so we'll get stuck right into them. So I'm really keen to kick off that conversation with our panel and trying to reflect back to the start of the year, if we can all imagine that far back. It seems like many years ago, I'm sure, for a lot of us. But thinking back to the start of the year before COVID-19 sort of set in and disrupted a lot of our lives this year, I want to ask our panel about some of the trends that were occurring in sport before this disruption. So Dan, maybe I'll start with you first. You work with a range of organisations and right holders. What did you see as some of the prominent, areas leading up to 2020 before the coronavirus pandemic set in?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It seems like another lifetime ago, doesn't it? I look back and I was thinking of stuff that our team was working on in Q4 and Q1, and I've got maybe 3 buckets of headlines, and it seems like such a more relaxed time thinking back to it. But I'll frame that answer externally, internally, and then from a mentality standpoint. Externally, I think the things that we talked about with our clients in the NBA and even in your parts of the world with Cricket Australia and Tennis Australia, the concept of a chief fan officer, that it was never a better time to be a fan. With digital connection points and the ability for teams and organizations like the Richmond Tigers to have conversations with their fans rather than at them. And I think that's really kind of getting to that digital era. Internally, I think one of the trends that we were really seeing and helping teams and leagues with is maybe break down the silos that exist in an organization. You've got the ticket and the commercial departments that maybe sometimes don't always share the same objectives. And we were seeing breaking down those silos, which I think was a win for the fan and a win for revenue. And then a mentality standpoint, there were 2 things that we were working on right before COVID, a ton of work with the NBA. And then we were so proud to work on the Women's World Cup strategy, which happened 3 days before the NBA shut down. But the concept of revenue beyond borders. And for us, that means mental borders, geographic borders, and kind of the art of doing something that's never been done before. And I think there was a lot of momentum on that. So the chief fan officer, organizational approach, and then breaking down those borders internally, externally, those were the things that we were seeing on March 10th. And certainly, as we all know, the world changed in the days that followed.
And didn't it change significantly? I think there's still some really great takeaways there that we might continue to talk about as we look into recovery too. I'm sure a chief fan officer sounds like a dream job for many people who might be joining us today. So we'll definitely unpack that a bit more. we do have two polls with us today. So I'm going to be using initials as well to help with the confusion. So I'll go to Paul Y now if I can. From your work, particularly in the areas of stadium technology, I'd love to learn more about what you were seeing during this time.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. We were seeing and probably will still continue to see the need and the, I guess, insatiable demand for content at both the live experience and via broadcast or digital. But from a live experience perspective, with the digital transformation of LED displays, bigger video boards, higher impact AV and PA systems, that whole of all sensory perception, all sensory sensors being taken over by high impact content that's relevant to the sport or the team or the brand, and doing that in a really meaningful and exciting and dynamic way is something that the majority of venues we're working with around the world are trying to grapple with from a business model perspective as to how they continue to turn the dial on their content creation, management and delivery through their technology set to continue to excite and inspire and enhance the fan when at the venue. And secondly, to that, we were just seeing a continual movement to the data-driven decision-making and a desire to further segment the fan groups. And I know that Paul F would know a lot about this, but businesses trying to really truly understand their fan better so that they can then curate that experience across all touch points, to Dan's point, in a far more tailored, personalised and customised manner. So that was sort of the two groups of things that we've been seeing really heavily around the world over the last 12 months, Casey.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And it's really interesting. I think we'll talk a lot more about that content delivery and what that looks like as we look to recover too, as it's changing so much. So looking forward to talking to you all more about that. So Paul, as Paul Y touched on, now going to Paul F, you might be able to give us some more background from your work, because your organisation looks closely at those trends of how consumers interact with sport and media. And we do know that that's been very much accelerated in the last 6 months. But what were some of the things that you were seeing before the coronavirus set in?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. So, when I think about this, the big thing was the fragmentation. So, and this has been a trend for far longer than just 12 months. So it's been a long-term trend in terms of the fragmentation of how fans consume sport. So, a long time ago, it may have just been a live TV broadcast. So I watched it on TV or I attended an event. So, but we know, and Paul White touched on it before about needing to segment fans. There's so many different types of fans now, and they each want to consume sport differently. So there's so much fragmentation about when they consume sport. So it's not just live now, it's sort of catch up, it's recording, playing on demand type things. And it's the fragmentation of, what device they consume that on, what platform, who they watch it with, and where they watch it with. So these types of things have been a trend sort of before COVID, but they're really going to accelerate. Sort of what we've seen accelerate in the short term, particularly, is just the adoption of new behaviours. So some of these things were quite slow, but different consumer segments have accelerated their adoption of some of these new behaviours. So people have been forced into using Netflix as their preference. So rather than turning on free-to-air TV or Foxtel and seeing what sport is on, they might go straight to Netflix. So there's this change of behaviours that has sort of been accelerated. And it's also accelerated the adoption of new platforms. So Amazon Prime launched, they used The Test, the cricket documentary, which was a really good sort of piece of sport content. But that accelerated people adopting new platforms, whereas previously they might have been a slow uptake. So yeah, the fragmentation was there, but it's just been accelerated sort of over the past 6 months.
Absolutely, it has. And we'll transition our conversation now to looking at some of those changes that you've all started to highlight, which is going to form a lot of our conversation today as we look to adapt and recover and see what some learnings are that we can take as we move forward. So obviously the disruption in the last 6 months and COVID-19 have caused major impacts. And one of the obvious examples that we're going to look at is the sport in empty stadiums. And like Paul and Dan mentioned, this shift to increased media consumption of sport content and the use of different platforms. But before we get our panel's observations on these changes, we wanted to play a video. As I mentioned at the top, we have some content provided from the Richmond Football Club where we've asked David Asprey and Kane Lambert to give some reflections on some of our different talking points today. So this video we'll just play for 30 seconds, and we just asked the players to give us a bit of their reflections about what it was like to play in stadiums with no fans. So if we could play that now, and then we'll have a discussion.
Yeah, playing in front of no fans initially at the MCG was quite eerie. It felt like a little bit of a ghost town at stages there, especially when we used to play in front of 90 to 100,000 screaming Tiger fans.
Yeah, playing in front of no fans initially probably took a bit of fun out of the match day experience, but there's always an adjustment period with significant changes like this, and initially we probably didn't cope all that well, but now we've adjusted, we're performing well.
Okay, so there's probably not too much there that we wouldn't have expected from players, and we have seen a lot of other players and athletes express sentiments to David and Kane from that. But I guess from someone like myself who identifies as an avid sports fan, I think it's reassuring to hear from athletes that fans do make a difference and fans are valued. We like to think our participation as fans is something that gives something to the players, and a reciprocal relationship because they give so much to us, and we like to play a role as fans and contribute to that experience. So it's nice to hear from athletes that that's confirmed to some extent, and we really do thank Richmond for providing that content. We'll share a few more videos as we go along this morning as well. But I guess what I want to do in this section is look at those reflections, but also have a discussion about the sports management side of this and the fan engagement side of this as well. When you have empty stadiums and no fans, how do you connect with your fans from a consumption point of view? So I might start with you. From a stadium view, how have you seen sport organisations and stadiums adapt over this time? And what is part of the consideration for your partners in planning for the return of live crowds, if we ever get them back?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. We've had a really immediate live. Sorry, was that Dan or Paul there?
That was you.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Sorry, guys. We've had just an immediate experience in the last 4 weeks in that our technology team ran the contact tracing and technology effort at the US Open Tennis. So it was really interesting to see how technology is now being used for operational compliance and management purpose, as well as how the players and their coaches and officials actually handled it and dealt with it. So what the team did, and the couple of key things that are becoming used for safety, security and compliance are artificial intelligence, and machine learning is becoming incredibly important. So I'll touch on that in a moment, as well as wearables. So RFID wearables and the tracking and tracing of smartphone devices and other RFID tags that are on key people. The way they did it, and we did it at the US Open Tennis, was to ensure that a whole range of IoT sensors were placed throughout key areas and key rooms, players' lounges, hotel foyers, etc. And a set of business rules were devised such that only a certain amount of occupancy of the rooms could be there at any given time. And what was happening was data sources from CCTV cameras, from the mobile phone devices, RFID chips and so forth were being ingested into an artificial intelligence engine, and in real time notifying through video board and displays, mobile phones, etc., which rooms were full, which lounges could be used, and assisting both the players and officials understand where to go, as well as the management and operating teams keep track of movement. So technology was used in the first instance to manage crowd movement, crowd density, crowd occupancy. And then secondly, from a contact tracing perspective, there were 6 confirmed cases of COVID-19 on site at the US Open Tennis. But the moment that was a confirmed case, the tracing and working back through all of those data points to see where they'd been, who they'd been in touch with, and otherwise enabled the tournament to act really quickly to keep in control of the effort and make sure the tournament could proceed. So the French Open at the moment, however, are having real troubles in terms of how they're coping with things. So I think the first point there is new age technologies such as artificial intelligence and wearables are becoming critical now for the operations of a venue, not just previously the fan experience. And secondly on that was, look, it's just the athletes are under far more constraints and duress than they've ever been before. And I think it shouldn't be lost on anyone, whether it be the AFL or NRL hubs or the tennis or otherwise, that they're making considerable sacrifices in and of themselves to be living in often environments that have far greater constraints than the people around them. So really interesting and a big movement, Casey, that's now accelerating venues all around the world to need to embrace operational technologies to help run their venues into the future.
Definitely. And I think I'll come back to Paul F now just to touch on some of the points that you raised in our previous section when we're talking about those media platforms. Like Paul mentioned, the increase in technology now is just so rapid to respond to what we're going through. But there's going to be all these new technologies now that we can use for other purposes. From a sports media and a content, I guess, perspective, Paul, what do you see for some of these new technologies and new platforms to how fans might be able to connect with their teams moving forward?
Yeah, so I think, like I touched on before, previously it was just through the TV, whereas now there's so many more devices and different ways to connect with their sports. So some of the research we did during COVID, we actually found that about 20% of Australian sports fans actually felt like they were going to move away from watching live sport in the future. So, this was during the period where there was no live sport, and their perception was that even when sport comes back, I might not start consuming live sport the way I used to. And that's because they've found other things. They've filled in that time and they're focusing their attention on other things. So it's a bit of a challenge for the industry. We're going to have to sort of work out how to keep those people engaged. But the positives are that what we did see was that fans are, they do have a strong interest in alternate forms of content. So it is, watching the match is important, but it's all the other types of content around that. So I touched on the test documentary, but, these sort of behind the scenes documentaries and insights really got a lot of traction during sort of the COVID period. The Jordan one in particular was, I think they fast tracked that. That got huge mainstream sort of coverage, and in Australia as well, and not just from sports fans, but from across the general population. And actually, it was quite interesting. We saw a spike in interest in basketball across the general Australian population, which was, quite interesting during a period where there was no live sport. There wasn't much going on. It was the off season for the NBL, but we saw a spike, overall interest in basketball. So I think we'll see more of these alternate, forms of content, so the behind the scenes type things. We saw people working out new ways to cut up and show sort of replays and highlights from, the greatest matches from yesteryear, these types of things. The other thing that technology really helps is we also saw a lot more content produced by athletes and players themselves. So I think previously, there's always been a lot of content pushed out on digital and social channels. And often it's quite high quality production. But what we did see was, people becoming more comfortable just pulling out their camera phone, producing some content that's not overly scripted. And, we've all got used to doing video calls for work, and people are becoming used to just living differently, and the athletes are the same. So I think I would suspect that the athletes are going to work much better with their sports and their clubs to be able to produce interesting sort of behind the scenes content as well. The last thing I'll sort of touch on is that we're all, a lot of people are working from home, and we may see a shift that's going to continue, once we can go back into the offices. But working from home means people have got more time to consume media. And one of the interesting things we did see, and if there's any employers listening, they may want to sort of turn away, but we found that 50% of people do stream media content during the day when they're working from home. And about a quarter of those people were streaming sports content. So, it's the fact that we can work 9 to 5 and we can also watch content on the side and potentially on our second screen. So yeah, a lot of those types of things are just really going to be positives for sports to find new ways to keep engaged with fans.
There's some really interesting points there, Paul. Thank you so much. And I think for anyone who wants to discuss or have some more information about some of those content creation that's come out of this time, I would really encourage you to reflect back on our discussion that we had 2 weeks ago about narrative content. If anyone here missed that one, you can have a look at the recording. So it's definitely some great takeaways there that speak to a lot of what Paul mentioned. Dan, I'll come to you now because I would love to get your understanding of, we've talked about the fan connection to this content and these new technologies. How are sponsors adapting to this space and how they reach their fans from a sponsorship and stakeholder point of view?
Yeah, well, I can tell you for us, November 11th or March 11th, was the day that the NBA canceled, and you saw a domino, and that was a Wednesday. And I would say by that Friday, the 13th, ironically, we were on conversations. Most of our clients are on the team side. So the New York Knicks, the Dallas Cowboys, just helping them navigate all those worlds. I would say at that time, there was really 3 reactions, right? There was the, Paul, to your point, we're all at home in Zooms, and who's that guy there? Oh, that's the lawyer. He's going to sit in on this, and we're pulling out the contract, and we're going to have that discussion. And then there's others that were very collaborative of like, hey, this is going down. Let's figure this out together. And, let's understand what and how your objectives are changing. And then there was a third group that I think was in the middle that I think was a little rudderless in terms of what they could believe that was happening. So we called that a failure of imagination, right? And I can come back to that. So what's been really interesting is, it was just on a week and a half ago was the 6-month anniversary of that moment. So we were looking back, we talked to those teams, and one of the ironic things that occurred of those 3 groups, the ones that really lawyered up in the beginning, almost to a T, they're the ones that are struggling with their renewals, because it's a little bit more of a combative conversation and not maybe understanding that the airline that is their partner is also going through a hard time, right? Or whatever that is. The most unique thing that I think I can share is the organizations that approached it with a collaborative mindset and we did a lot of data work and behaviors and cause related and came back with ideas. Not only did they deepen the relationships with their partners, but some of those sponsors even invested more dollars with the team. And a good example of that would be, I think we're all working from home. I've got a 6 and a 4-year-old, and it's chaos, right? So some of those brands said, hey, we've got some HR dollars, or, our people and culture budget. What would it look like to have a player do a virtual chalk talk with our employees' families, or, do different kinds of things that maybe the moment allowed you to do? So we talked a lot about the advantage and the disadvantage in that moment, just that creativity that came from that. So I thought that was really interesting. And then what I would say, those were organizations where the rug got pulled under, where the events were canceled, similar to the Richmond players, fanless, and you're adjusting to this awkward moment. And then there were some, like the NFL, where I think there was a general feeling at the time that they had dodged a bullet, on the timing. And if you recall, they had the NFL draft, which was in April, big TV event, a lot of sponsor activation, a lot of alcohol and spirit partners, so the over 21 audience. So I think we found ourselves looking at pivoting some of those strategies into a digital activation environment. And I think that change of that consumer consumption, and I love this, even kind of looking ahead of what's around the corner and not knowing, continuing, the failure of imagination of what our world could be like in the weeks and months to come. But one of the big beer partners, we were on a call, they sponsor 18 teams, and we looked at a pivoted strategy with digital content, segmented strategies and activation versus the standard, let's have a party in the equivalent of the chairman's room at the MCG with a legend and tick the box, and that's what we do. And the head decision maker said, this was the first sponsorship that's been created post-COVID that I would have bought on March 1st. And so I think that's been a huge Northern Star or Southern Cross, depending on where you are in the world at the moment. But we really took that moment seriously. And I love that of, as innovators, what do we want to do to create that is not just a make good and covering up a Band-Aid of a challenging time, but truly a make great that would have made sense before COVID and even in this moment in time and for many years to come. So I think those are those headlines of how you treat people, the relationships, how creative you are using the data. And then I love that aspiration of, is this a Band-Aid, or is this something that would have genuinely made sense before pandemic hit? And that to me is the sweet spot for those types of collaborations.
I think there's a lot there that a lot of our audience can take away from, Dan. So thank you so much for sharing some of those top line findings from your space. We're going to move the conversation now into what we've already started to touch on, which is this changing nature of fandom. So Adam's going to jump on and take this one. So take it away, Adam.
Thanks very much, Casey. And I think we sort of had identified some themes, and I can see Paul's just popping them up now. And these were really taken from a number of different reports which have been sort of generated and brought out over the last 12 months or so. And I think already, as I've been listening to our panel, have really articulated a lot of these and a lot of the implications of them already really clearly. So thinking about fans having much more choice, broadening and fragmenting both what they support and how they consume it. This idea of increased fan power, obviously technology, data and digital has been critical to our discussion already. And something we'll touch on particularly in the next section around this social awareness of fans as well. So I think these are all prominent trends. We were going to ask our panel to delve into them a little more, but I think we've already given some great examples. So I might sort of jump straight into some follow-up questions. And Paul Fuller, we might sort of start with you. And I'm interested in, obviously the media consumption is changing, but how you see particularly perhaps some of the technologies coming into this space as well, particularly immersive technologies and that sort of area, and how that's moving and how that might lean into some of these trends. What are you seeing with organizations?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So when I think about the technology, first point, we've got to think about the fans. So they're obviously got much more choice with what they consume. But when we think about their behaviors, they're less loyal than they used to be, and they're less predictable. So going back, people were fairly predictable. People used to watch Friday night football, every week. Whereas now there's so much more flexibility. So we need to give them that choice, and we need to give them the flexibility so that they can choose to consume it when and how they want. So from a technology perspective, it's about making sure that they've got cross-platform abilities, so that when you're producing content and making that content, that it's really agnostic, and that it can be consumed through whatever device people are using, and at different times. So I think Optus Sport here in Australia and how people consume the Premier League is a really good example, in that, it's a subscription service, but it's an app on your phone, but you can effectively watch it like you consume sport on TV. But you can also watch it when you're outside. You can watch it when I'm working from home, on my mobile phone, sitting next to my desk. So, it is the one, single sort of platform that they're using, but it's got cross-platform abilities. And when I think about sort of Australian sport in particular, because of the revenue models for a lot of the big sports, which are so reliant on the big TV broadcasters, it's hard and it's slow to move away from that pure just free-to-air broadcast model or sort of Foxtel model. But we're going to see more of these sort of, I think, sports taking back control, because it's not always in the best interests of the TV broadcasters to go down that cross-platform sort of approach, because their revenue model is sort of ad-based for the most part, for the free-to-air network. So I think it'll be the sports taking back that, taking the initiative and sort of working out how they can build these cross-platform, devices, for people to consume. And it's going to be challenging, because I think in the past, sports have tried to do different things for different devices and different platforms and different segments, and but we know they're going to have to prioritize. So the best way to do that is work out what are the ways we can be efficient and make that content available through different places, but do it efficiently.
And those new platforms are interesting because they've got basically a 24/7 remit. They're not limited to just the match content. So I guess combining that match content with the other narrative content and the other pieces of content, merging that into social provides a vehicle to do that. Paul Yeomans, we might jump to you. I was interested before hearing you talk about the operational applications of technology. If we start to, I guess, reconcile these trends and then look forward a little bit, how do you see some of that technology perhaps enhancing fan experience, or some of those technologies, AI and some of those immersive technologies, influencing what we might see in the fan experience? What's best practice in terms of what your partners might look at?
Yeah, I think much to the same way that COVID's heavily accelerated technology adoption from a consumer perspective, sitting at home, I think it's forced venues and organisations to look at the power of technology in a different way from an operational and experiential sense as well. I think over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the late adopters would really look at a whole range of these technologies that the return on investment relates solely to advertising or sponsorship, so forth. But it was like boiling the ocean a little bit, trying to get the organisations to understand that, no, if you truly embrace the power of your network and understanding what your customers and people are doing, you can start to make real and tangible cost savings around the way that you operate your particular venue. So I think everyone's had to sit down and understand, firstly, what they've currently got by way of technology, then what the gap is between what they've got and what they would need to be able to deliver on their operational needs, their experiential needs, and facilitate the next wave of commercial outcomes. So I think firstly, it's dramatically accelerated businesses' understanding of what they've got and what technology can do. And for those that are understanding that and have done so, there's a couple of examples that we've seen that I think have been really great over the last few years as to how they've used those technologies to enhance the fan experience. And the first one is, Pepsi and their halftime show at the Super Bowl the year before last down there in Atlanta. If you might have recall the Maroon 5 and concert at the halftime of the Super Bowl. What they were actually doing there is utilising all of the audio feed coming from the lead singer and triggering the content in real time, running through a whole raft of different portable and movable LED devices. And so there was a huge amount of technology power that was taking the time recording of the audio, triggering a content engine, syncing that into movable LEDs to produce that whole show. So I think back to that immersive experience perspective, in typical way, the NFL and the Super Bowl and what Pepsi were doing there was fantastic and first class. But then I think tennis and IBM and their partnership with IBM and tennis has been doing some really great things as well around understanding crowd noise, sentiment, the movement of different people in crowd and audiences throughout their venue, and beginning to turn that into kind of real-time fan engagement modules around the, how loud is the crowd, or how is the sentiment towards different players and so on. And they did some really great artificial intelligence related activations at the US Open last year, and then no doubt at the Australian Open coming up. So I think that what we're seeing, Adam, now is brands, venues, and organisations, and the fans themselves start to actually understand what is possible and have the personnel making those decisions and bringing those to life almost catch up with the power that the technology can actually bring to life. So we're seeing a huge enhancement of attention at executive level to the value of technology and the outcomes that it can deliver. And I think that's probably accelerated 5 years of adoption into a 3 to 6 month period. And one after the next, we're seeing sports and teams announce Zoom or Microsoft Teams as a partner to integrate and bring to life fan content, or YouTube, or the new stadiums in LA at SoFi Stadium announcing new partners. So I think the domination of big tech is only going to become more and more pronounced. And the good news is I think that's going to bring to life far more amenity for the fan, far more rich and material content, and far more efficiencies for the venue and sports who are putting these big shows on.
So some great examples there. Dan, you've already given some great examples as well around the sponsor and partner side. I guess I'm interested a bit from the fan engagement side of, Paul's talked about some really good technologies there, but where's the line between, I guess, something that's a bit gimmicky and doesn't connect versus something which is, truly engages? Are you having conversations with partners, or what's your advice for how organisations, I guess, navigate that to really make sure something's meaningful? And any examples around that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a couple thoughts building on even what Paul was saying. I think at a core, again, what's an idea that would have worked on March 1st that translates to this current world? Any of those fan enhancements, and especially when you're putting a sponsor in, it should always enhance versus interrupt the fan experience. That brand is making my love of Richmond Football Club or the Australian Open or Paul's example of the Super Bowl that much greater. So it kind of starts and ends there. I noticed in meetings that we had with the NBA, the National Hockey League, in preparing for the bubble, and the use of technology in particular, and then getting those sponsor make goods, of the difference of a tick the box versus accelerate the heartbeat, and kind of that as a disconnect. And I think coming out of this, those were really interesting conversations to be a part of. And I think, again, going to my earlier point of organizational mindset versus department, I think in some cases, the technology decisions, for better or for worse, were made by the operations folks, and they fulfilled a purpose. They existed there. And now you're seeing white space machine learning and the business analysts, as well as the sponsorship team, getting involved, where you're starting to look at that as revenue generators that happen to use technology versus tech. So it's a multi-prong, which I think, to Paul's point, is really accelerating what's possible. And you've had to do it on the fly in Zoom with kids screaming in the background, you know, in some cases, which has been a blast and a headache at the same time. But I think those are some really interesting, you know, thoughts, I think, when you start to look at it. And I think one thing that's really interesting with the fanless environment, and I'll maybe just help even for the audience, the mindset that we've tried to really reflect on. In a normal world, as much as we want to think differently in sport, we live in a fixed mindset, right? Where we have the same calendar. You know, Friday night you watch the footy. This is when you plan. This is when you do your budget cycle. And whether we've realized it or not, we've become zombies sometimes to that cycle. And I think what this era has taught us is embrace a growth mindset. How all of the little things, what can I do to grow? And technology was built for the fans at the stadium. You know, the video boards at the MCG or the SCG face the crowd in the stands. And now, you know, we're having conversations with the NBA. What about if we keep some of these courtside screens? What would that look like? How do we do that? And what's involved in there? And I think those are fascinating discussions, but I think you've got to stay true to that. How does it enhance the fan, position the brand, versus seem like, you know, an interruption as well?
Sure. Let's jump to the last of our core sections, which is around talking about sport as a social tool and fan connection. I think it's really prominent in the current environment. So one thing we have seen over this time, and I know Paul Fuller alluded to it, was this idea that athletes have become more prominent as content creators, and in terms of their ability to get engagement through their content. So as part of that, they become more visible. Their voices become really important. So we'll again here, if we can, Paul, bring in the athlete voice. And again, we spoke to the Richmond players a little bit and asked them a bit about some of their ideas about how they viewed the role of the athlete voice and how things were changing. So this will run for about 90 seconds. We'll ask Paul to hit play now.
Yeah, I think part of the responsibility of being an elite athlete, having a platform and being part of such a big football club like Richmond, there's a real opportunity to educate and help drive conversation around particular, you know, social issues and trying our best to impart some sort of change in that aspect of society. Of taking a knee and the continuation of the movement that we've been a part of. Obviously, the incident in Minneapolis with George Floyd was the catalyst for a lot of the conversation, but it actually drove a lot of our playing group to understand how a lot of social and political issues lie within our own country. So there's been a lot of research, a lot of conversation, a lot of education around that.
Yeah, so we discussed the significant events going on in the world in regards to taking a knee pre-game, and it was something that we felt really strongly about. And we do such a great amount of work in our footy club and our community for a multicultural and equal society. And it wasn't just a one-week movement for us. You'll see we're still warming up in our black shirts. So it's a conversation that needs to continue, and the education needs to continue. And we felt we have a great platform to be able to do that, but there's still a lot of work to go. And
I think as a whole football club, our platform has grown enormously over the last few years. So how we want to use that is always a topic of conversation for the playing group and for the football club. So a lot of the group are really passionate about a number of different social issues. So yeah, it certainly has changed, and it's not just coming from the leaders of the playing group or the leaders of the football club as a whole. It's coming from the entirety of the football club.
So I think both David and Kane there talk about obviously the growing athlete voice, but also that it's not just about athletes, it's a whole club movement in their case and their perspective. Paul Yeomans, I'll start with you because I know you've got a bit of an athlete management background here as well. And I'm conscious of time, so we'll just keep it to sort of a minute or so per person if we can for this section. But Paul, particularly interested in your views of how you're seeing opportunities for athletes and fans to connect around this social issue.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think it really is a double-edged sword at the moment for athletes, which I guess we kind of feel for is that on one hand, the direct channel between athletes and their fans via social media and so forth is bringing that relationship closer together, and athletes are able to show their personality more quickly in a more raw and genuine manner. Direct to the world. However, that can also put themselves at risk of mistakes being made in an immediate sense that have dramatic impact. I think some of the things up in the hub where what would have been probably innocent mistakes by athletes or others because of the amplification of social media, the athletes are fined, their families are fined, they're in this little interesting time, I think, Adam, where the greatest value of them bringing a personality and having a voice and grasping their relationship into the community is also putting themselves and their employer at risk if it goes wrong. So I think that, I guess, as a society, we probably need to understand and respect the fact that each of those athletes and players will have their own opinion and have their own different voices, but collectively not be so quick to judge or blame or be so, I guess, abrasive or antagonistic in some of those responses. I kind of feel a little bit for the athletes at the moment that they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. And so I think hopefully the wider community and the industry will start to understand and build some kind of social mores around how the interaction between athletes and their fans can continue in a digital world.
Dan, huge visibility in North America as well around athletes and using their voice, and also teams as well. Any reflections from the last 6 months about opportunities here, or what you've seen, or the fan reaction?
Yeah, so on building on what Paul said, and I think the Richmond players referenced the incident in Minnesota. We work really closely with the Minnesota Twins, which are the Major League Baseball team, and the Minnesota Vikings, the NFL team. So, take you in a window there. The power of data in measuring, I think what the desire that you want to do, both as an organization and then even empowering the players, allows you to understand sentiment. So we've been providing our clubs with what we call a social DNA report, which lists the demographics and the needs and the attitudes around these complex issues to help inform them, to either accelerate an opinion. And it's been really fascinating to understand for them, in some cases, maybe leadership or folks that are in the executive level might not understand the way their fans feel. So giving their fans a voice, going back to that first point that I shared with Casey. And then I think for the athletes themselves, it's just really helping them understand a strategy, and to give your voice the right amplification. So I think Paul Fuller referenced earlier about the content and all the different things that we do. So we've been trying to tell athletes, as much as they'll listen, content is king, but distribution is queen, and she wears the pants. We want a good distribution schedule, and how you do it on Instagram versus other platforms to make sure that message is heard by the right audience in the way that it's intended. So I think that's been really fascinating to see, a little bit of that pivot, and then, the risk of it, right? In some cases, these are young men and women, very emotional conversations, and helping them to understand that what you're going to put out there, it could be on the front page of the newspaper in the morning or that afternoon. And here's some things to basically think about before you hit send. So I think also too, at least in our part of the world, it's really deepened the trust between, you know, maybe the stool, three-legged stool of the league, the teams, and the players to really work in unison on something to unify a bit more. Whereas before, maybe it was a player that was, you know, a little bit more screaming from the rooftops, and maybe that voice wasn't heard. So I think that's a fascinating thing. And I think this is a category and a trend, a cause, however you want to bundle that I think, especially for those teams that are returning, you're going to see more of a focused engagement that I think that fourth stool of brands will start to get involved, you know, as well into that conversation in the same way they might be in an environmental cause or, you know, a lot of our military causes that might exist in sport as well. So I think that'll be really interesting to see, but I think that stool has evolved from maybe a unicycle from players to the three-legged one. And I think the sponsors are going to be the next one to join, which I think there's more wheels together. It's just going to continue the motion moving forward collaboratively. And I think the fans are responding very favorably to that, because I think ultimately, if you follow the data, it goes back to their voices, you know, being heard based on what they're saying on all the social channels.
Lots of complexity, obviously, in constructing that message, as there are to those issues. I'm conscious of time, and I know we want to get to our last closing question. So, Casey, we might jump into part 5.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I mean, this conversation could go for hours from my point of view, but we do have to wrap it up shortly. And I've just noticed that we don't have any questions from our audience, which I think means that you've already answered everyone's questions because you're such a fantastic panel. So we'll move into what we're looking forward to, which we've already touched on a little bit with highlighting some of the innovations that are coming through during this time. But I want to understand maybe what some of the gaps are and what we can learn and continue to develop. You've already all spoken about so many great things that are coming through, but what are some of those gaps that you might have identified in all of your work? So maybe Paul Fuller, if we start with you, are there some things that you really hope that we start to move towards in doing more research in or investigating more, or what do you think is the next step to come out of this space?
Yeah, I think for me, like when I think about the gaps, is that it's not necessarily the lack of ideas or possibilities about what we can do. It's about what should sports do that's sustainable, and what makes it sustainable is can they fund it, basically. So a lot of, and we talk about, you know, and this has always been a challenge, that there's a lot of content that does get pushed out there via digital channels, but does it generate the revenue? And so, you know, it does, but is it enough to offset some of the old school revenue models, which are previously built on mass TV broadcast rights, sort of attendance, membership? And if fan engagement is shifting, and if attendance is dropping in the future because, you know, not as many people are going to matches, that could flow on to membership. You know, we already see there's, you know, lots of discussion around TV broadcast rights here in Australia, and whether that's going to Foxtel or, you know, some of the new players, you know, the telcos. So I think for me, though, a lot of it is around these new digital ways of communicating with people. How do you commercialize that? And, you know, I think that's the biggest gap that sports do need to work out. You know, we need to replace some of the old revenue streams, and what's the best way to commercialize that? What will fans pay for? The good news is, again, some of our research that, like, the younger generations that do consume content, they are more price sensitive. So they don't necessarily want to pay for things, but on the other hand, they are prepared to pay a premium for good content. So if people are putting good things out there, people will pay money for it.
Paul Yeomans, a final thought for you about some of the gaps in research that are there?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting and significant opportunity coming up that relates to the research world, and that is with artificial intelligence engines assisting venues to not only run in real time, but seek to predict the way crowds will come, how many will come, what they will do, the way they will navigate the area, what they'd like to eat, all of those things in order to drive greater efficiency and operating costs. We're seeing a enormous global demand to now truly understand what are all of the external factors that may influence somebody coming to the MCG or not coming, somebody coming and drinking alcohol that night and catching a train home rather than parking, because occupancy, utilisation, crowd space and distancing is not going anywhere. This is going to be part of our future. And so in order to run, to Paul Fuller's point, a profitable venue and a profitable event, you have to get really sophisticated with the cost base and the operating model, and starting to really research the external factors that can ingest into informing those decisions, to me is a really important point globally moving forward.
Thanks, Paul. We are right on 11. So Dan, maybe if you've just got a quick 30-second wrap up for us just about some gaps in the research that you'd like to see addressed.
Yeah, I want to get through 4 final points. So number 1, the mentality, move at the speed of digital. The process that we're doing, start, stop, continue. It's a wonderful time to look at your own business and what should we start, stop, and continue. I think the vision statement that we're trying to help teams with is revenue is a result, not an objective. Define the objective first and then figure out how to monetize it. And I want to end on, we need an alter ego for these times. And we found a beautiful woman, Midge Donahue, who in the 1920s was the first female executive in Major League Baseball during the Depression, an economic time. She invented the season ticket, names on the backs of jerseys, game day giveaways, and the skybox in a time of depression. And I think it's just a wonderful time to study her inspiration. We call it Be Like Midge, to come up with those ideas that had never been done before, that are more economical, more innovative, and frankly, just make a lot more sense for the fans as well. So Be Like Midge would be our number 1 charge, and look up Midge Donahue.
That's an amazing note to finish on, Dan. And anyone who knows me knows I love my women in sport history. So you're a man after my own heart, and I'm going to go get some Be Like Midge badges made up, I think. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there because we are over time. I'm so sorry that we can't continue the conversation, but we will put everyone's details up on the screen now, so you can jump online, connect with our panel on Twitter, connect with them on LinkedIn, so you can keep having this conversation, because I know I definitely still want to. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned at the top, this was our final event in our Sports Fan series that the Sport Innovation Research Group have hosted with support from the Social Innovation Research Institute. We have loved spending every second Friday morning with you over the last 6 weeks to share these ideas, raise these questions, highlight insights, and discuss the many ways that fans connect with and consume sport. There are a lot of challenges that our industry will be faced with, and as we look to recover, I think it's a great time to start talking about these ideas, and I hope this event this morning has started to help you think through some of those challenges and ideas as well as we look to move forward. Thanks everyone for attending today and over the past few weeks. We've been thrilled to host you, and we'll keep everyone connected with our news, events and opportunities with the Sport Innovation Research Group via our email list. So keep an eye out for those over the coming weeks. Thanks again and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, guys.